Welcome to What the Duck, a podcast with real experts talking about direct spend challenges and experiences. And now, here's your host, SourceDay's very own manufacturing maven, Sarah Scudder.
Thanks for joining me for What the Duck, another supply chain podcast brought to you by SourceDay. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and this is the podcast for people working in the direct materials part of supply chain. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S. Scudder on Twitter. If you are new to the show, make sure to follow this podcast so you don't miss any of our direct materials supply chain content. Today, I'm going to be joined by Katie Smith, and we're going to discuss how to overcome data and system gaps when buying parts and materials. If you work for a manufacturer and are struggling with a lack of visibility of product and part lead times and orders manually hand-keyed into the ERP, then this episode is for you. Katie is a digital advocate with 15 plus years of experience in procurement, sourcing, supply chain and operations in manufacturing, tech, industrial distribution, and retail. Katie is a Purdue grad, go Boilermakers, I think I said that correct, and a rescue dog mom and a mom of an upcoming engineer. So welcome to the show, Katie.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here.
So Katie and I have had a little bit of a challenge getting our interview scheduled. I want to say we're 3 weeks in the making between travel, holidays, getting sick, and then her and I were both in the Bay Area the last couple weeks with torrential downpour and storms and power outages. So we've persevered, and here we are.
Yes,
so
we
Katie,
have.
I'd like to have you describe yourself in one sentence.
That's one of the toughest questions, I think. After these last couple of years, I think when I run into other people, they said, I thought you were taller. After spending a couple of years on videos. So if I reflect what other people say to me, I thought you were taller.
What do you do for fun?
We're still kind of recent transplants to Northern California coming out of the Midwest. So we really love exploring our new territories. It's just beautiful. Driving trips, hiking trips, wine tasting, just exploring everything that California has to offer and making that part of our free time fun.
I was born and raised in Cali and spent a lot of my time in Sonoma County. So if you have not yet checked out Sonoma County wineries, I highly recommend. I have to say, I think it's the real true wine country.
Go beyond Napa.
Katie, when you and I were prepping for the show, you let me know that you were raised in Indiana, and you mentioned something called Kiss the Brick. So I'd like to have you tell me about.
So Indiana, probably one of the most significant landmarks, I guess you'd call it, that many people, not just in the United States, but maybe the globe would be familiar with, is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which hosts the Indy 500 IndyCar racing. So it's a big deal to us, especially during high school, taking days out there. But it was actually built in 1909 and ended in a physical brick racetrack. And the bricks for the finish line are still out there from the original build. So it's a big tradition if you're out at the speedway and you have a chance to get out on the racetrack, is to kiss the finish line bricks.
Very interesting. That is something that I've not even thought about putting on my to-do list.
Most people would not have yet.
So let's get personal a little bit and talk about the beginning of your journey in procurement. So you actually started your career at Sears. Talk to me a little bit about how and why Sears.
I would say it truly was the start of my career, but I was a very small accessory manufacturer, jewelry and accessory manufacturer before I joined Sears. I met a vice president at Sears, and we struck up a really good friendship, sponsorship, relationship. And like a lot of us in our career moves, I made the move to Sears through that relationship. I was invited to come in a junior buyer when they were at the time, because I would say I was at Sears from almost some of the acquisition years through the divestiture years. And so I started out as a junior buyer, really on the direct side and product management for a number of our different products. But after doing that for my first few years, I was introduced to indirect procurement when indirect procurement was embracing the first consortium buying and the first digital tools that came out in the market to help really digitize, streamline, or leverage a spend for buys. And so I was attracted to jump over the indirect side. And what I found fascinating is instead of really managing a product line at a time, be it accessories or jewelry, or where I started on the soft side of Sears, was in indirect procurement, you really had a view of the infrastructure of the entire company, whether or not you were supporting IT or marketing or construction, etc.
How did you get involved? So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is you have experience in direct and indirect. This is a podcast focused on the direct side. And then you also have a background in manufacturing, which a lot of our listeners and guests work in the manufacturing space. So how did you get involved in manufacturing?
Early in my career on the direct side, we were very active in flying to our suppliers to collaborate with them and work with them on their plant floors to see like their CAD CAM and their design and walk the floors hand in hand with them. So it wasn't owning the direct manufacturing at that time, but working very closely with them through the entire design, production, and then of course on the other side, inventory management, right? So really running the end-to-end supply chain, but with very strong partners in manufacturing. And then after I moved from retail to indirect distribution with W.W. Grainger, which was very similar to a retail environment, some bricks and mortar, some service-based deliveries, and then high tech, I then pivoted and really thoughtfully chose my next experience and to challenge myself with it being in the manufacturing space directly. And boy, manufacturing's tough. There's a lot of piece parts moving. It's one thing to collaborate with a manufacturer. It's another thing to become part of the manufacturing environment.
So you pivoted to actually work for a manufacturer on the procurement team. So what was that journey like for you? And maybe highlight a couple of the most important takeaways.
Yeah, the first one was I knew it would be a challenge because I had traversed a few sectors. I'd really moved sectors in my career and always try to become a really active learner so that you have a lot of agility in your career. I knew it would be a lot to learn, but I embedded myself in the same way that I did with every promotion or every new organization that I joined. I really found the leaders to just really sit with and say, tell me what's important to you. Tell me how you build this. What's your design process? What's the end-to-end project process? And then sit with everything from engineering to IT to legal to business ops and finance and really learn the environment. And then spend time out in the plant, spend time out at a erection site, spend time out in the field, actually like seeing all the parts come together for the manufacturer. I think that's one of the most important things to do is really learn your environment. And then in learning the environment, figuring out what the business processes are currently and why. Because you may come from a different sector, a different company, and it's not like you want to walk in and say, gosh, why are we doing this? Instead, it's what's the underlying reason that we produce this way or that things are forecast in the following manner. So following forecasting through design, through the order process, which is what it was when I joined the company. That's what we had. And I joined the company really in meeting the management team to build out a strategic procurement department, which in the past preceding was an order desk. And we all know an order desk is reactive orders. And so when I sat back and we talked about strategic procurement, it's like taking forecasting into estimating, materially segmenting it, category managing, and then doing dedicated go-to-market strategies with your suppliers on how you take the buys to market. So it really started working on that. Very complex in manufacturing, and especially in something like construction manufacturing, any manufacturing that has thousands and thousands of parts that are all needed to make an assembly or to make a product. And one of the things that I recognize right away, as you and I have talked about and you opened with, is what are the gaps? How are we not excelling at this? Out of those thousands of parts, did we know one would not arrive in time for the casting, for the production, and things of that nature? So I mentioned that I'm a digital advocate because I believe that these things really can't be controlled by humans through spreadsheets, is that only through really aiming for the best in digital systems. Sometimes it's hard to get there, but it's good to aim for the best in digital systems. Can we correct some of those gaps?
I call
overcome
it
them.
Death by spreadsheet or death by email. The cringe when the one person who has the information on their computer or their email is out for a week. Right?
Yes.
And you've got the emergency that happens and no one has access to the data information.
Yes. That's what I always have said too. Probably the biggest, the riskiest knowledge management is knowledge that's sitting in someone's head instead of a process or a processed digitized outcome, certainly.
So most recently, when I actually saw you a few months ago last year, actually at a conference as well, you were running procurement for a company called Clark Pacific. And one of the things that I know that you were really focused on in that role was process documentation. I would like to have you walk me through why that was such a focus and priority for you.
I recognized within my first 30 days at Clark Pacific that there was an absence of process documentation. Coming into an existing team and needing to build out a team and build out even new processes, I like to understand the current processes. And when I asked, so do we have these in, a handbook online? No. Now that didn't surprise me. That happened at a number of companies before, but I'm a big advocate of process mapping. And if possible, if more than one of the team does some like process, I actually like to get the team together in front of a whiteboard and process map. Because what you find is, like most knowledge that's held just in our brains, there's a lot of assumptions. We may make 1, 2, or 3-step leaps over actual actions that need to happen for it to be complete. And other teammates who participate either in the inputs or outputs can help each other poke holes in it in an environment of trust in drawing that process map for the first time. The process map also allows us to have a lot more insights into what could or should be digitized. Because, by the way, I think any of us who are digital advocates know we've never digitized 100% of our work. I know that there's a lot of great chat going on AI and how much things can be digitized, but I've always found that there's a balance of the manual with the digital. So a process map allows you to see who's doing what, have a discussion about why, find out that there are gaps that even team members can point out to each other, and then brings it to a level of having much more depth of what actually happens for that process to be completed. What it's also allowed is it allows us to investigate the process and have a conversation. Again, when you're drawing a process map together, an arena of trust, saying, but why do we do it? Is it necessary? Is it good? Is there anything we can streamline or eliminate before we start to digitize?
That's why I know a lot of HR teams will try to hire people with very specific industry experience, but I'm also an advocate of bringing people in from different industries because I think they can look at processes and systems and bring in a different perspective that may not have ever been considered if you only have people who have worked in a certain industry or space. So that's
correct.
The why, right? Why you focused on process documentation in your last role. The big question now is how should a buyer document her processes if she has never done this before?
Yeah, and this is something that people actually do find really difficult. Because if I said my perfect environment is if you can get even a small team, whether it's 3 or 4 people or anything over 7 or 10, sometimes maybe a little bit too much for this process. But if you say to somebody, can you document what you do and bring it back to me? Sending that poor person off with a blank piece of paper is really intimidating. It's going to be riddled with just absence, right? Some gaps. So I like to show people, do a demonstration of tell me what you do, and I'll actually map it on a whiteboard with them. And then we'll get a little bit of experience with it together. I'll put markers in people's hands so that they can start collaborating. Now, once you get that experience done on a whiteboard and you've taken it to a degree that it's fairly thorough, it's well below a level 1 process. You got level 2, level 3 steps, etc. Then I always like to find somebody. I have the experience, but I like to find or train somebody on my team to then emulate it in a process map. Now, whether that's in Visio or PowerPoint or Miro, I don't really care what the tool is, as long as you get like a physical digital map that you can not only show what the process is, but also put in swim lanes of who's doing what and the process handoffs so that it's in order of the process. So taking it from the physical to the digital and then testing it.
So to recap, what you said was you will train somebody on the team and then have them go create a process map, and you can see how well they learned and how well you explained to them based on what they've actually put on paper.
Exactly. It builds up kind of the understanding and the acumen of the team of why are we digging into process? Why are we looking at it so strongly? And one of the reasons is that I'm a strong believer that you have to test your processes and maybe even change some of the process. You don't have to overhaul all the processes, because you don't want to take an assumption of a process or even a process that could or should be streamlined into a digital tool, into a solution. Then you're just taking the assumption that what we have is great, now we just need to digitize it.
I'm always someone who throughout my career has liked to volunteer to train other people, because I feel like I've learned so much from actually being down and teaching and training someone, because you may know something in your head, but doesn't mean you have it clearly organized or mapped out. So I think that's an important process, part of the process as well.
Yeah.
So when we were prepping for our interview, a few times you mentioned the phrase progress over perfection. Why?
I think I really learned this early in my career, and it was just really honed home, is that no matter how many smart thoughts you have, if you can't execute, you haven't delivered. And I think I've caught in that trap of analysis paralysis in past lives. And I've seen certain team members and peers and friends in my companies who also, if I could just do these slides one more time, if I could just have one more week with this analysis, I'm like, it's okay to present it as is. Just say what the assumptions are. That's one thing I learned too, is don't put it out there as the truth. Put it out there as a hypothesis with, here's the assumptions that we had to make because data and stuff that we scrubbed is imperfect. Right? And we recognize that. But if we put it together and at least put a hypothesis of this is what we see, I'm going to give you a couple examples. At my latest company, Clark Pacific, when I said, what do we spend it on? You can walk out in the plant in the yard and you can see it all in action. But again, where's the demand management? What do we spend most on? What do we spend least on? And when we went to pull it out of our ERP, we couldn't see it. It said parts in the description. It wasn't classified. So even if you have data, that doesn't mean you can do anything with it. I know. So finding out what you have to work with, this is just an example. Classifying data is an imperfect science as well. We took it from maybe 30% visibility to over 90% visibility in 6 months, just doing the hard work of classifying what we bought. And in doing that, we couldn't wait to become 100%. I kept showing it to the management team when we went from 30 to 60, from 60 to 70, from 70 to 90, because there's so many people in a company, even a smaller company like Clark Pacific compared to my Fortune 500 companies prior, that you've got to bring people along with you on what it is and why it would make a difference. And did we have assumptions about what we bought, or how much or how little, or the frequency, or with who? And things of that nature. So progress over perfection all the time. I don't know if it was originally a Microsoft focus, but I remember that from hearing Microsoft releases. Do not wait for perfection. You want to be early in market rather than late. And spent a good amount of time in ops as well. And operations is all about execution.
So when we were chatting, prepping for the interview, you broke out a couple challenges that were really big pain points for you last year. So I want to split those into the first half of last year and then the second half of last year. What was the biggest direct spend challenge that you had to overcome in the first part of 2022, and how did you overcome it? Because I think it's really important for our listeners.
Landing a new company, and we already talked about setting the foundation of how to learn a new company. I quickly found that, boy, not only were we in COVID, but in manufacturing, with material constraints of supply allocations, that we also didn't necessarily, without it being COVID, we might have been well covered with our supply base. But within my first 60 to 90 days, I realized that we didn't have enough suppliers to supply us during COVID because it was a material crisis. There were allocations, there were rations going on. Having to quickly shore up what is our supply base, both primary and secondary, and leaning into the existing purchasing team, the becoming procurement team, the engineering team, a number of people, and quickly assessing what other suppliers are in the market. Doesn't matter if we haven't talked to them in 6 years. So identifying, reinvigorating relationships, giving them the storyline of why to do business with us now in COVID, and quickly onboarding more of a security of supply in that allocated time period. I would go hand in hand with that, though, and then say, but then we had to bring that knowledge to and publish it to the company. Who were our suppliers? What did they categorically supply? What is their lead time? What has their price volatility been? Really tracking almost on an index basis so that there was much more transparent information for planning, because a lot of the ordering in the early was still just-in-time ordering, which we all know just-in-time went a little bit by the wayside in COVID.
So building out your supply base and try to ensure consistent, steady supply, that was the first part of the year. The second part of last year, you mentioned you had some big data challenges. So what were the data gaps that you had, and why was this such a big problem?
We already touched a little bit on spend, right? And I think all of us in procurement and manufacturing, we would say, boy, you don't know what you're making as a product, but you don't know what you're making if you don't know your spend at a commodity and a part level. And so we already addressed that a little bit and setting up a spend cube and the criticality of that. But the next tier was, there was an ERP that had been put in. There is an ERP that had been put in a few years prior. And certainly when you start investigating not just the process mapping and the spend, and then you move on to digital tools, boy, now you're really poking into a lot of areas. And people are like, but it's a lot better than it was a few years ago. But I noticed in the environment that the ERP did not have an intake or a requisition as part of it. And so acquisition, what do you want to buy, had been built on the side, but it had been built as a flat file to then be emailed, to then be hand keyed in, even to get a quote out to a supplier. And I'm like, whoa, this is not 2022.
Makes me cringe again.
So I will say, I got a lot of support, got a lot of momentum and support, and really started pre-automation, and not just automation for automation's sake, automation for accuracy, automation for transparency, automation for productivity. Because when you have even a small and mighty team, hand jamming, hand keying in everything they do, there's going to be human mistakes, right? So we built an intake and a requisition tool in-house, company of engineers. So we did build this in-house on the backbone of SharePoint. But we made the intake form automated. If somebody started typing their name in, it recognized who they were. It populated their email, it populated their contact, it populated location, GL of their overhead, all that stuff that people were clawing back and writing down and hand keying in as best guesstimates. And we know what that does to a GL if people guess what the GL is. And so we had the form pre-populate. And we only allowed procurement to override if somebody said, I made a mistake, or this is being bought. And we even got it sophisticated enough that you could do buy on behalf of, so that it would automatically grab their GL, their location, their shipment information. And that was the first tier step, so that we didn't have both our engineers or our procurement team really hand keying in forms just to say what I need to buy. The next thing that we did was I was very passionate because these were disconnected. Even the new requisition intake solution, it was still disconnected from our ERP. So it already started, as soon as we started building requirements off the backbone of the process, and the rec tool was working with IT to say, okay, all these fields that we fill in are a match to a field in the PO in the ERP, the PO creation. So rather than the team opening up a new form in the ERP and once again, hand keying in what they've taken from intake, I know, is that it would take all the data that was largely auto-populated with the relief of maybe less than 20% of the form, which required a little bit, again, needs human interaction to finesse. And then as soon as it was reviewed and approved by procurement, just meaning they were doing checks and balances because it was a new tool, that they could then, after many setups and trials and user acceptance testing, that IT worked with us to integrate all that information directly into the ERP and automate a PO being stood up. So we removed people off of 6 years ago that were buying off of sticky notes, completely manual keyed in intake form, to a largely 80% automated form with much more accurate detail, which, by the way, we all know, but I'll give you one analogy. One person keyed in, I need 900 pieces. It came back, and our people caught it and wrote in 900 pieces, and they came back a week and a half later and said, that was supposed to be 90. It was not off the shelf, and the supplier had already started manufacturing 900. So again, when I talk about like the benefits of digitization and checks and balances, if somebody has a range that they can click down through or double check, and they're not spending all their time manually working, we have time to double check ourselves. We have time to do reviews and approvals. And so we also automated both operationally and financial the approvals as they were going through, which before had been ad hoc selection of individuals.
So the theme I'm hearing from you is automate, leverage technology as much as you can. So you're putting systems in place so team members, often buyers, are not manually entering data, keying information into an ERP system and into their tools. In my experience in working in the manufacturing space, a lot of small and mid-sized manufacturers have very tiny technology budgets, or they may not even really have a budget. What do you recommend for people who are listening to the show that fall in that category, that say, Katie, we align and we love everything you're saying, but we have a very small budget?
And I would say you have a small budget for procurement. You don't necessarily have a small budget for production, for manufacturing, for SRM, right? So there's a couple things that if you can tie what procurement can do for the company back to their customers, fulfilling their customers' needs by manufacturing and producing on time with accuracy, with less shrinkage, loss, or waste, that's one of the keys to get at. You write your business case on the goals of the functional company, of the business, not a procurement tool business case. That's number one. Write it on the goals of the business, tie the need for the solution and the expenditures in and how they will fulfill the goals of the company. Because you also have to show in your business case ROI. If we're going to spend this, what's the return on this? And I cut my teeth early on in Sears and Grainger and so on, working with a lot of the top 4 consulting companies. And so early on, I saw from them how they would write a business case and how it needed to address things not only organizationally, operationally, but financially. And it was based on the goals of the company, not on one function. And I found that very valuable. And I've tried to teach that lesson to other organizations and teams that I work with. Also, by the way, work with your suppliers. It doesn't mean you need to take all of their facts and figures, but they're very informed. It's part of their sales case of what's the ROI of bringing this product on.
And I would also say technology does not have to be expensive. There are a lot of solutions, especially in the manufacturing space, that are built for small and mid-sized manufacturers that are priced accordingly. So it doesn't mean you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get technology that's going to be impactful and meaningful for you.
True. Yeah, very true. And I think what you hit on, Sarah, is on the manufacturing space. While larger manufacturers may have an SAP or something of that, and I've worked with that too, that doesn't mean that we didn't augment it with specialty bolt-on technology that was not terribly expensive that fixed a problem. So that's a great point that you bring out about small and mid-sized manufacturers. There's a lot of there's good agile tools. There's really good, they're not suites of tools, but there's a great selection of tools out in the market that can help us with our problems.
So we addressed the systems gap piece of the topic for our interview today. I also want to have you give some advice, again, really looking at the small and mid-sized manufacturer, about what they can do to overcome data gaps.
The first thing is pull your data as is into a data table and just look at it and say, does this tell me anything? Because it's almost like process mapping, is you have to data mine. So you have to pull your data. You have to have somebody who's familiar enough with where your data lies. What does it take to extract it? Are they familiar enough with the tables to grab all or the right data? And just lay out your data and take a look at it. And does it give you the information that you need, or the story that you're trying to learn, or the story that you're trying to tell or teach others? Because otherwise it's going to tell you where you gap. The example I gave you when we pulled all of our transactional data at Clark Pacific, and the majority of the transaction line description said parts. Right? There wasn't a category. So I think testing your data, your existing data, then learning where you have to enhance it. And where you have to enhance it is really investing back into your technology, because it's almost remediating your existing data, right? You have to enhance it. You have to identify what's missing. You have to identify how you would enhance it, how to test that to make sure that it works. And then you just start like anything else, progress over perfection. You start enhancing the data, testing it, pulling it, doing reporting off of it. Is this giving us what we need? Or does this need further cleansing, testing, enhancement?
Thanks for discussing how to overcome data and the system gaps when buying parts and materials today, Katie. If you have anything to promote or a project you want our audience to know about, now's the time. And maybe share a little bit about where you'd like to send people if they want to check you out or potentially connect with you.
Sure, absolutely. I love networking. I mentioned that I'm a constant learner. And as you mentioned, Sarah, we're always ready to learn from somebody else. So I'm at Katie Smith on LinkedIn. That's my primary platform. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And reach out to me there. Reach out and connect. Just love to share knowledge and learn knowledge with other people.
If you missed anything, you can check out the show notes. You can find us by typing in What the Duck, another supply chain podcast into Google. To have optimal search results, make sure to add another supply chain podcast in your search. To ensure you don't miss a single episode, make sure to follow this podcast and subscribe to us on YouTube. If you are new to the show, make sure to follow this podcast so you don't miss any of our direct material supply chain content. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S Scudder on Twitter. This brings us to the end of another episode of What the Duck, another supply chain podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and we'll be back next week.